Hello there and welcome to the Ashanti analysis for the management case study for February 2020 on Trevel Records. So here we are with the preceding material and the contents page, but just before we get stuck into what the video series is about and what we're going to look at in this video, let me just introduce myself very briefly so that we can become acquainted and then we can crack on with all the good stuff with Trevel Records. So I'll do that now very shortly. Hello there and welcome to the MCS pre-scene analysis. Now this is just an intro clip to introduce you to what the product range actually is and sort of, the contextual factors so that you can have the utmost confidence in the process for your exam success. So the first thing is that my name is Joseph and I am the MCS expert at Ashanti. I write mocks for the MCS as well as offering, tutor responses to any MCS queries as well as F3 queries, and I also write portions of our study text in regards to the MCS and F3. So that is my sort of background. I've been, working with the MCS for around 2.5 years now. It's quite a few sittings so far, and I've had a lot of sort of knowledge around this kind of level for a number of years now before I took over as the MCS expert at Ashanti. So you can find sort of sneak previews and video clips surrounding the MCS and exam success in the case study at my Facebook page, which is sort of shown at the bottom. If you search that, you will find, all kinds of clips on a weekly basis regarding the MCS, even when there isn't a pre-scene around yet. We look at some examiners' reports. Okay, so besides that, what actually is the pre-scene? Well, it's a video series first and foremost in this analysis. We go section by section, covering each page in as much detail as you'll ever be required to do. It's very speculation based, but ultimately we're using our P2 and E2 theory in sort of the page, like the wordy sections of the pre-scene to pull out all the relevant points, as well as, applying F2 to our numerical information in the financial section. So the key points, industry guidance and how that relates to the company, and also we apply the business models. This is done mostly in the strategic analysis, but there will be mention in each section when it's particularly relevant. We talk about extensively the likely exam issues based on applying all this theory as we go through. So there will be hints to you and sort of key focus points for you to pick up on as we go through. There's also, these sort of standout exam hints and tips that we do come across. Like there are some that we're speculating on, and there are others that are just huge indicators that I will 100% point out to you, sort of the given questions that will definitely turn up in one of the variants. And potentially that variant is yours. We then have the strategic analysis, which is a very focused business model to pre-scene sort of video and presentation. And we have the top 10 most likely issues, which follows up all this information with essentially the top 10 problems that are likely to come up in the exam, with the top 1 to 4 being almost a guarantee that they will be, definitely there. We have a pretty good success rate. I believe in the past 5 sittings, we have scored about 7.5 correct issues in the majority of the different variants. So with that in mind, you can have a lot of confidence in our sort of guesswork and speculation. And then there's the other ones near the top of that list, which are basically guaranteed to come up. So how is it going to work? We'll go section by section. We'll assume that there's no knowledge as I progress. So by that I mean you haven't pre-read the pre-scene. We'll be going through together as it was our first reading. If you've already read it, great. But I will assume that you have not read further on at any given point. The only thing I will assume is that you're relatively well versed in our F2, P2 and E2 modules, at least enough to be able to go back and revise a topic if, we mention that it's particularly relevant. What I suggest throughout this series is that you read a section and make notes just before, you watch it, or just after you watch the section. And this will mean that you can compare and contrast with my speculations and sort of inputs, and this will give you the biggest and most well-rounded exam prep you can possibly get. So very much go with that. It's very, very useful. And as we go through, of course, I'll have my review. At each video end, I will sort of sum up to the best of my ability what we've covered and why it's important. And of course, the last two products, we'll be going through a full strategic analysis and the top 10 issues, which are pretty straightforward as we discussed in the previous slide. So, without further ado, you will now cut to the current MCS pre-scene for you to get stuck in with. Okay, so typically we have 6 videos as part of the pre-scene document analysis, where we're going through each page, page by page, as if we were reading it for the first time. And we're trying to pull out all the key sort of aspects that relate to certain modules, or just sort of strategic or issues that may arise in the unseen material that will give us context and confidence when we move into our response for that exam. So the first video is going to cover the introduction through to the business models. We're going to cover, just those first 4 or 5 pages. And then when we get to the business models, we're going to look at the overview of each of the business models. And then we're going to pause there before video 2 takes over. And that will take us through to the music charts. And then we're going to go through chronologically until we get to video 5. And video 5 is going to skip ahead very slightly to the news reports, which are essentially several sort of excerpts that the examiner is giving us for free, sort of highlighting key issues that may arise. And the reason for that is because video 6, we traditionally put all the financial information, which will be extracts from the annual report essentially. So throughout these videos, we're going to go through page by page until the last 2, or we'll flip it very briefly just because of how we typically do things. So with that said, let's now start with the introduction. The thing I want to point out here especially is that we have the pre-scene, which is our context for the exam, our fundamental knowledge to understand before we can go on and take on the exam's unseen material and then respond to the question we're given. However, this seemingly innocuous page is actually the context for the entire pre-scene. So actually it's the context of the context, if you will, and actually there's loads of information that we can pull just from these simple sentences. So, for example, we first see that Trevel Records, or Trevel, is a quoted company. So in that case, we know that it is listed on the stock exchange. And when you're listed on a stock exchange, you are typically subject to a higher amount of regulation and information dissemination. So for example, in most stock exchanges in the real world, you have this aspect of, okay, you have to publish this amount of reports and give this kind of information to the public, which otherwise you wouldn't have to do if you were just a private company. So there's several hoops that we have to jump through as a quoted company, and it's worth keeping in mind that does have some knock-on effects in terms of our equity options too. So we're not really going to have the opportunity to have an IPO for equity finance, but we do have the option of something like a rights issue, where we can issue new shares to existing shareholders for a discount on the current share price to generate some extra equity for us to go about our projects. So that's the first thing. We also see that they create and sell music. So music is a highly competitive industry, as we saw in the intro pack. If you haven't checked that out, take it from me for now, that it is extremely competitive. Loads of different people aiming to be, the next musician. And with all those musicians, you've got all these other record labels that are starting up as indie labels, or there's some big established ones, and they're all vying for the same attention of the masses. So it's a really competitive industry, and we have to think about how that might translate to the market forces present. So for example, we have Porter's five forces as a general model. However, I do want to point out that for this syllabus, the models are a little bit less prominent. You don't necessarily have to go through the models as models, but you can use it as a good way to understand the different aspects of the market and how it's influencing the business. So, highly competitive industry, and we also see that it is a global market. So, in this case, if Trevel are selling to a global market, then they are potentially going to have a large amount of subsidiaries. Because of the advent of the internet, it might be possible that there isn't that many subsidiaries to account for. But if there are, let's say for example there's a Trevel Records in several different continents, where we've got one as like an Asian branch, one as a sort of North American branch, etc., then that may lead to group accounting, which then has the group accounts IFRS that we have to take care of and understand in terms of implications. Now, what I do want to reiterate before we go too further into the financial content and F2 in general, at the case study level, you're not really going to be doing too much in terms of preparation and calculations. There may be a few small calculations that you may want to do as part of your response, but typically the large bulk of all F2 responses or information given in the unseen material in the exam is going to focus very much on the impacts and implications, or perhaps financing options. So instead of preparing the statement, you have to be able to communicate how a certain event will have an implication on our reporting. So what changes, not necessarily actually presenting the financial statement itself. So do keep that in mind. And once again, finance options do come in a little bit, because of course if we have a positive MPV project, something we want to undertake, that needs funding. So we have to discern which funding option is best. And finally, on this one sentence, we have Trevel's based in capital city in Fortuna. So we have a made up country, which is going to get further developed in the next paragraph, it looks like. But the one thing to note is that if you're in the capital, you're going to experience the base characteristics, the general characteristics of that country, because typically the capital is affluent. It has the bulk of all the businesses and the sort of social aspects. So with that in mind, anything we see on Fortuna, we can expect to be especially relevant to the very local conditions of Trevel. So with that said, let's put that on paper before we move on to that second paragraph, because already we can see that that one sentence has a lot to remember. So now moving forward, we have a description of Fortuna. Fortuna is a developed country, so immediately we know that there'll be a lot of technology involved, a very developed pop culture in terms of music, and that the people in Fortuna have a high standard of living, where there's a sufficient disposable income to be able to afford regular spending on entertainment. So the first thing we have to point out here is that our local demography are going to be very much suited to selling music to. So with this in mind, we are based in a location that has a substantial market for our product, which is music. But what we see here is that this could also be in the form of books, cinema, or theatre. This means that there are substitutes in the market for the general population. So whilst we don't necessarily use the models very strictly in this upcoming syllabus, we can think about Porter's five forces here insofar as the substitutes are concerned. So we'll remember that the substitute force can be high when there's a number of different things to substitute in for the product. And in this case, music can seemingly be replaced by cinema, theatre, or books in the sort of overall demography that are interested in Trevel Records' products. So do keep that in mind as we move forward, that we're vying for competition in terms of attention with other forms of media as well. Next, we see that Fortuna's currency is the F dollar. Now, this is very, very important because in tandem with this global market, this means that we're going to experience foreign exchange rate risk. It's going to be present in our overall operations, and with that in mind, we have to consider our risk management approach. And then when we're thinking about risk management, we're typically going to bring up something like the TARA framework. So that would be transfer, avoid, reduce, and accept as our different options available to managing risk. And in this case, we're going to be sort of pushed into a case of reducing it with several different instruments. We can have a forward contract and options. We can have a swap. But overall, we don't need to know about the mechanics of these instruments, but just know that there are several instruments such as options, swaps, and forward rate contracts that can mitigate foreign exchange rate risk. So do keep that in mind. It is quite relevant, especially if we see in the financial statement that there is going to be maybe some FX losses or gains depending on translation. It's not always there, but if it is there when we get to it, then that's obviously going to be a bit more relevant even than now. And finally, on this sentence, we see a very standardized gift from the examiner, always reminding us that IFRS is our predominant regulations that we have to adhere to as accountants in this locality. So with this in mind, it's simply saying don't worry about Fortuna being a made-up country. They adhere to IFRS. That's what we want to know. Very typical, very standardized, so don't worry too much about that. But I will remind you now that in terms of F2, it's very much dominated by financing and implications on our reporting. So knowing which IFRS is relevant to certain events, acquiring a rival, potentially group accounts obviously, and also in terms of maybe royalties, we've got contracts with customers, IFRS 15, that may be coming up in future as well, I imagine, because of the way music works. Next, we see that Fortuna is one of the top 6 countries globally for music sales, and collectively these 6 countries account for more than 70% of revenues of the sales of recorded music. So in this case, we immediately see there's quite a high sensitivity to those key markets. So we're going to heavily centered on those 6 countries, and if we were to amortize those, or sorry, average those across that 70% of revenues, you're looking at roughly 12-ish% in terms of how much they are each relevant to our revenues, which is quite a significant portion. For example, if 2 countries that are interlinked in maybe a trade war, such as the US and China at the moment, and do remember that CIMA do take inspiration from real life events, then suddenly revenues may be hurt quite significantly just from the pestle factors involved with those 2 countries. So in this case, we are susceptible to the sort of external factors present in 6 different countries in particular, and this will be centered on pestle. So we have to think about our pestle analysis, breaking down the different features of the political landscape, the environmental landscape, technology, etc. All these things need to be thought of, especially when it comes down to legal and economic. They can be quite significant factors, and with this in mind, we then have to, consider the sensitivity. The sensitivity means that it's an increased risk compared to perhaps just any other countries. So in this case, we might have to think about sensitivity analysis to certain countries. We may get asked to, sort of break down how bad it would be if this country has an economic downturn. I think that'd be pushing the strategic level more so than the management level, so don't lose any sleep over that. But just to sort of get you thinking about the kinds of ideas we need to be having in our minds right now, definitely think about that sensitivity, risk management, and the kind of pestle analysis that's involved there as well. We also see that English language recorded music sells well in any of those countries, despite English not being the first language in many of them. So this doesn't have any very direct implications as far as I can tell. You may have a slightly different take, but where I do think it's relevant is that if we were to acquire a rival record label, perhaps situated in one of these non-English speaking, or rather in a country where English is not the first language, then perhaps we have some cultural issues to overcome in terms of realizing the synergy between the two companies. So typically you're going to acquire a company because you believe that you're going to gain something from bringing the two entities together, whether that's supply chain efficiencies, whether it's certain skills on the opposing company that then brings in-house and you've got extra competence. All these kinds of things are why you might go and acquire a rival. But if there's cultural issues that are in the way, that are barriers to making a good transition to one entity rather than two, this may be where it arises, because you have different language, maybe a different business culture. So it's something to keep in mind. Again, we're not going to focus too heavily on modules, but you can take a look at McKinsey's 7 S's in terms of what makes a good company culture and how we can translate that outwards to our new company, our new entity, to sort of bring about those synergies that we want. So keep that in mind as a potential thing, but at this point in time, don't worry too much about that. That's probably not going to be focused on heavily. It'd be quite a weird angle to take it, but do keep that in mind. Next, we are told what our overall role is. So we are a financial manager at Trevel's head office. So we're in the main company. If we do have subsidiaries, we are as part of the parent company. Our primary responsibilities are associated with management accounting, and you report directly, or rather you report to the SFM, the senior financial manager, who then reports directly to the finance director. And this is relevant insofar as we have sometimes a direct link between us and the finance director, and this hints at a greater strategic focus or recommendation focus. This one, however, and where they've worded it, very much situates us in traditional management level accounting, which is going to be not really recommending too much, just reporting on the implementation on the strategy that's being given to us by the finance director, by maybe some of the input of the senior financial manager. But compared to us, we are going to be focused more so on just that implementation aspect. So do keep that in mind. It is relevant. This is not the exact same across all pre-scenes. So bear that in mind, that there will be very limited scope for recommendation, I suspect, based on that statement. Finally, we get a little bit of information on the music industry, wide-ranging and diverse. So this to me is a hint that public relations are really critical. Our branding, we know, is super important from the industry pack. If you haven't seen that already, just to give you a brief rundown, is that because we have such a focus on different artists and pop culture, the record label need to have a really good marketing approach to both the brand of the record label and the brand of the artist, and really make sure public relations is working in their favor to really push and stand out in a competitive industry. So with that in mind, wide-ranging and diverse means that we're going to have potentially some scope to offend people, perhaps with maybe a poorly worded tweet or something on Instagram, social media, etc. There could be a big sort of issue for maybe a CEO or an artist, causing a massive stir with something that isn't quite right to be said. That's just where I get that from. That's, to me, that small sentence is probably actually meaningful. I doubt it's just thrown in there. So do keep that in mind. And Trevel is a recording company or record label, and it generates revenues from recording music for sale either on physical media or digital distribution channels. And as we saw in the industry pack, and I'm sure we'll see in future, the streaming avenues are very, very large, but they don't pay very well. So there is that tension in the industry as well. And this is also a point of contention in terms of getting fair compensation for the artists, because streaming doesn't seem to be actually benefiting them too much, aside from the fact that their music is more accessible and is actually promoting their live performances in sort of a cross-marketing aspect. So they lean very heavily on these live performances rather than having big album sales these days. I mean, it's still relevant, still generates a lot of revenue for both the label and the artist, but streaming is almost like a small income, but it's a huge amount of the overall market, and the reliance there is that it builds the brand, builds the artist, builds the audiences in live performances. So do keep that in mind. Hello, it's me again. I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time to first extend my hope that you enjoyed the free sample that you've just viewed, but also to just sort of explain what else a strategy do to help you pass your exam really effectively, provided you found our sample particularly interesting and insightful, of course. So, of course, we have a study text for every module, ranging from P1 to F3, and the certificate level is also free on our website. So we have study texts throughout the CIMA course, every module you could hope to study. The certificate level are free, as I mentioned, and then the rest of them, ranging from P1 to F3, are all available to purchase. Alongside this, if you're not so much a study text kind of student and you prefer a visual way of learning, we have the course videos. We essentially break down the study text into bite-sized presentations with a walkthrough, and it's a very engaging way of explaining the course. Following this, we have the pre-scene analysis, where we break down each pre-scene sitting into a number of videos, going through the whole document, but also adding a top 10 recommendations for what will come up in the exam, and also a strategic analysis where we put all the models you'd find in E2, for example, to the pre-scene itself, whichever that may be at the time. Alongside this, we provide an industry analysis. This is a document and accompanying video which help you give that contextual information in your exam. So, for example, if the pre-scene is on the oil industry, the industry analysis will break down the oil industry, the current topics, trends, issues, what the competitive market looks like, all those kind of aspects, all condensed into one so you can spend your time wisely in your study period. Following on from this, when you actually want to practice all this knowledge, we have mock exams for all of our materials. So StudyText has a generic mock exam based on the module, whereas the pre-scene analysis has mocks available to purchase that are based on that specific pre-scene, that are targeted to the key issues we believe will come up. And if you're not content with just doing those mock exams and practicing that way, we have a marking and feedback system where you can purchase the ability to send in your paper, have it marked by a CIMA qualified accountant, and get personalized feedback on whether you can improve X or Y area. And sort of finally, if you will, if you're feeling really underprepared and that exam is coming really soon, the masterclasses are offered by Astranti, and they're essentially a crash course in anything you could want for that topic. So if it's a masterclass on the pre-scene, it's going to give you absolutely everything that you could possibly need to know about the pre-scene in one rather really condensed sitting. Likewise, if it was the F3 masterclass, you would have all of F3 gone through in a very crash course style presentation and video link. You can also purchase it post-stream as opposed to viewing it live, all these kind of aspects. We are very confident that these materials will help you get the exam success that you want. So we have a pass guarantee. Provided you fill out a form which demonstrates that you have utilized our materials to a large extent and actually taken the time to study them, and you have unfortunately failed, we will offer you the same materials again for the next sitting as a consolidatory offer to ensure that you can get back on the horse and get that exam grade that you want. With that said, thank you very much for watching the sample video. I hope you enjoyed it and it gives you a lot of confidence in Astranti and your CIMA future.